In 216 BC, the Roman army marched 86,000 soldiers, the largest force the Republic had ever assembled, to a small town in southern Italy called Cannae. Their enemy, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, had fewer than 50,000 men. He was outnumbered, out-resourced, and fighting far from home. By every rational calculation, Rome should have won before breakfast. By nightfall, 70,000 Romans were dead. Hannibal had not fought harder. He had not fought more bravely. He had thought more clearly. He had seen the battlefield and his own forces and the Roman army's psychology with a precision that turned apparent weakness into devastating advantage. He understood something that most people never do. The outcome of a conflict is rarely decided on the battlefield. It is decided long before, in the mind. We live in a world at war. Not the kind you see on news broadcasts, though that exists too. I mean the invisible wars. The ones that play out every day in offices and families and friendships and the private chambers of our own minds. The war between patience and impulse, between clarity and confusion, between the person you are and the person you are trying to become. Robert Greene spent years studying conflict, not to glorify it, but to understand it. He read the battle plans of Napoleon. He studied the psychological warfare of Julius Caesar. He traced the strategic thinking of leaders, artists, revolutionaries, and survivors across 3,000 years of human struggle. And what he found was not a celebration of aggression, it was a philosophy of awareness. Because the people who navigate the world most skillfully, in business, in relationships, in leadership, in their own internal lives, are not necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They are the clearest, the most disciplined, the most patient. They have learned to see the board before they move the pieces. This is what strategy, properly understood, actually means. Today we are not talking about war. We are talking about the invisible battles that define the arc of your life and what it means to fight them wisely. Section 1. Declare war on yourself first. Greene opens the 33 strategies of war with a principle that most people never expect from a book about conflict. The greatest battles you will ever face are not with other people. They are with yourself. This is not a metaphor, it is a strategic reality. Think of every significant failure in your life, or in the lives of people you know. How many of them were caused by an actual enemy, an insurmountable obstacle, a force beyond any reasonable control? And how many were caused by something internal, impatience, ego, fear, distraction? The refusal to face an uncomfortable truth, the decision to react rather than respond. Most defeats are self-inflicted. The Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi understood this at the age of 29, having won over 60 duels without a single loss. He wrote simply, "The primary thing when you take a sword in your hands is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. Ultimately, you must be determined to kill them. Killing your enemy is the one concern. But Musashi's real enemy, the one he spent his entire life studying, was himself. His impulsiveness, his anger, his desire for recognition, his attachment to a particular style or technique. The moment those internal forces took control, he knew the duel was already lost. He spent his later years in a cave, painting, writing, thinking. Not because he had retreated from the world, but because he understood that the most dangerous terrain any warrior navigates is their own psychology. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, a man who commanded one of the greatest empires in human history, wrote his Meditations not as advice for others, but as daily reminders to himself. Reminders about patience, about resisting the pull of vanity, about doing the work without needing the praise. He was, in modern terms, conducting daily reconnaissance on his own character. What does this look like in practice? It means sitting with discomfort long enough to understand it, rather than fleeing into reaction. It means noticing when your ego is driving a decision that you're telling yourself is principled. It means developing the discipline to distinguish between what is urgent and what is important, and choosing, again and again, to serve the important. The person who has not declared war on their own weaknesses will always be defeated by their own character before anyone else gets the chance. This is the first and most foundational principle of strategy, not tactics, not positioning, not the manipulation of others, the relentless, honest, courageous work of self-knowledge. Section 2. The strategy of seeing clearly. There is a cognitive bias that psychologists call the emotional reasoning error. It describes what happens when we treat our feelings as evidence, when we conclude that because something feels true, it must be true. Under pressure, almost everyone does this, and it is almost always strategic suicide. Napoleon Bonaparte was, by the estimation of most military historians, one of the greatest strategic minds in recorded history. His ability to read a battlefield, to see not just what was happening, but what was about to happen, to anticipate the enemy's response to his response 3 moves in advance, was without parallel in his era. And then came Russia. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen, nearly 700,000 soldiers. He expected a decisive battle. He expected the Russian army to stand and fight for Moscow, as any rational army would. He expected the campaign to be over in weeks. The Russians did not oblige. They retreated. They burned their own cities rather than let Napoleon use them. They refused to give him the conventional engagement he needed. Napoleon could not adapt his thinking fast enough. He could not let go of the battle he had planned for the battle that was actually happening. He rode deeper into Russia, pursuing a decisive moment that never came, watching his army disintegrate in the cold. Only 100,000 of those 700,000 soldiers made it home. He had stopped seeing clearly. He had begun to see what he wanted to see, what his ego required to be true, rather than what actually was. Seeing clearly is perhaps the rarest strategic gift. Not optimism, not pessimism, reality. The willingness to look at the situation, your competition, your resources, your relationships, your own capabilities, without the distorting lens of what you need to be true. Sun Tzu, writing in the 5th century BC, put it simply: know the enemy, know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be defeated. Most people manage maybe half of this. They know their goal. They know their preferred tactics. What they rarely do is develop an accurate picture of the actual terrain, the psychological landscape of the situation they're navigating. In business, this looks like the founder who is so in love with their product that they cannot hear what the market is telling them. In relationships, It looks like the person who is so invested in their own narrative of a conflict that they cannot perceive the other person's experience at all. In personal life, it looks like the persistent refusal to update a belief about yourself that stopped being accurate years ago. The strategist's most important daily practice is the cultivation of honest perception. The willingness to ask every day, what is actually happening here? Not, what do I want to be happening? Not, what would be convenient? What is the actual reality of this situation? Clarity, Greene argues, is more valuable than intelligence. A brilliant mind operating on distorted information will consistently lose to an average mind operating on accurate information. See first, then act. Section 3. Winning without fighting. The 36 Chinese stratagems, an ancient collection of military wisdom older even than Sun Tzu, contain a principle that strikes most modern minds as counterintuitive, even cowardly. When losing is inevitable, flee. Of 36 stratagems, fleeing is the best. We live in a culture that celebrates confrontation. We are told that winners don't quit, that backing down is weakness, that the measure of a person is their willingness to stand and fight. And so, we fight. Often battles we cannot win, often at enormous cost, often simply because our ego refuses to accept the alternative. Sun Tzu understood something different. The supreme art of war, he wrote, is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Alexander the Great, who built an empire stretching from Greece to northwestern India before the age of 32, won many of his campaigns before a single soldier drew a sword. He understood the power of reputation, of strategic positioning, of making the outcome feel so inevitable to his opponents that resistance seemed genuinely irrational. Cities opened their gates. Kingdoms negotiated rather than fought. The psychological war was won before the armies met. Abraham Lincoln demonstrated this principle in the theatre of politics, which is, as any serious observer knows, simply war by other means. When he entered the presidency, he did not consolidate power by defeating his rivals. He invited them into his cabinet. He kept his enemies close enough to watch and disarmed them by giving them a stake in his success. His most dangerous critics became his most necessary allies. The strategist's question is never simply, can I win this fight? It is, does this fight need to be fought? And if it does, is now the right moment? Is this the right terrain? Am I negotiating from strength or from panic? Timing is perhaps the most underappreciated strategic variable. The same move that fails catastrophically in one moment can succeed effortlessly in another. The person who acts too early is impulsive. The person who acts too late has allowed the situation to change around them. The strategist waits for the moment when their action will have maximum effect with minimum cost. This is not passivity. It requires, in fact, more discipline than simply charging forward, because the impulse to act, to do something, to be seen as decisive, is one of the most powerful psychological forces a person can face. In your own life, consider how many conflicts you have engaged in that cost you energy, reputation, and relationship capital. And what did they actually produce? How many arguments did you win and relationships did you lose? How many battles did you fight on terrain chosen by someone else at a time that suited them rather than you? The most powerful move is often no move at all. To watch, to wait, to let the situation develop until the right moment becomes obvious, and then to act with everything you have. Section 4. Emotional Warfare. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar received news that his ally and rival Pompey the Great had been murdered by the Egyptian court, a gift, they assumed, that Caesar would welcome. Pompey had been the last serious military challenge to Caesar's power. Caesar reportedly wept. Whether the grief was entirely genuine, historians debate. What is not debated is the strategic brilliance of what followed. Caesar arrived in Egypt and aligned himself with the young queen Cleopatra against the court that had killed Pompey. He spent the next several months cementing Roman influence over Egypt, one of the ancient world's wealthiest territories, while simultaneously managing the complex political fallout of Pompey's death with a public grief that positioned him as honourable rather than triumphant. He never let his emotions run faster than his thinking, not in victory, not in grief, not in fear. Emotional control is not the suppression of feeling. That is repression, and repression is expensive. It costs energy, distorts perception, and eventually ruptures in ways that are difficult to control. Real emotional mastery is something more subtle. The ability to feel your emotions fully while choosing, with intentionality, how they will influence your actions. Anger is perhaps the most strategically dangerous emotion. It is also, Greene notes, the most easily weaponized against you. An enemy who can make you angry has, in that moment, ceded control of your judgment to themselves. They have made you predictable. They have shortened your time horizon. They have narrowed your focus from the wide strategic view to the immediate provocation. Every time someone provokes you into anger, they are effectively borrowing your intelligence and using it against you. The moment you react from rage rather than reason, you fight on their terms rather than yours. Winston Churchill understood this. Through the darkest years of the Second World War, the fall of France, the Blitz, the string of early British military defeats, he maintained a public composure that became one of the most powerful strategic weapons the Allies possessed. It was not that Churchill didn't feel fear or despair. He did, profoundly. But he understood that the moment he displayed it publicly, the psychological war with Hitler's Germany would be over before the military one was resolved. His composure was itself a strategy, a message to the British people, to neutral nations, to the enemy: we have not broken, and we will not. Pride is equally dangerous, perhaps more so because it disguises itself as dignity. Pride makes you fight battles that don't serve your goals simply because losing would feel humiliating. It makes you double down on losing strategies because admitting error feels like surrender. It makes you treat your reputation as more valuable than your actual interests. The strategist carries a different relationship with their own ego. They are willing to retreat, to revise, to admit error, not because they have no pride, but because they have learned that their actual goal is more important than the story they tell about themselves. This is a discipline that must be practiced. It does not come naturally to anyone. Section 5. The Mind of a Great Strategist. What actually separates the great strategic minds of history from the merely competent ones? It is not raw intelligence. History is full of brilliant people who failed catastrophically when the pressure became real. It is not courage, which many people possess, but which, without direction, produces recklessness rather than strength. The quality that runs through Greene's study of history's greatest strategists, Alexander, Caesar, Lincoln, Churchill, the Japanese shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz, is something more composite and more interesting. It is the ability to hold contradictions, to be flexible enough to change the plan when the situation changes, while being disciplined enough not to abandon the goal when the plan becomes difficult. To be patient enough to wait for the right moment, while being decisive enough to act completely when that moment arrives. To care deeply about outcomes, while remaining sufficiently detached from any particular outcome to think clearly about alternatives. Tokugawa Ieyasu spent decades as a subordinate, a vassal, even a hostage, waiting with extraordinary patience for the moment when the constellation of Japanese power would allow him to act. When that moment finally came, after a lifetime of preparation and restraint, he moved with complete decisiveness. His victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 secured his family's dominance over Japan for the next 268 years. He understood that time, deployed strategically, is a weapon. The strategist thinks in time differently from ordinary people. Where most people think about what they want right now, the strategist is always calculating. What position will this decision create for me 6 months from now? 3 years from now? What am I building toward? And is what I'm doing today moving me closer to it or further away? This is what Greene calls the long-term view. Not naive optimism about the future, but the disciplined practice of placing every immediate decision in the context of a larger direction. Adaptability is the other essential quality. The great strategic plans of history are not valuable because they were followed perfectly. They are valuable because they were adapted, because the strategist had the capacity to absorb new information, revise their understanding, and respond to the actual situation rather than the anticipated one. Karl von Clausewitz, arguably the most sophisticated military thinker of the modern era, spent years analyzing Napoleon's campaigns and distilled his findings into a single concept he called friction, the difference between war as planned and war as it actually unfolds. No plan survives contact with reality intact. The strategist's skill lies not in producing perfect plans, but in adapting gracefully when reality asserts itself. In your own life, the question is not, do I have a perfect plan? The question is, how quickly can I update my understanding when the situation changes? How quickly can I release the plan I loved in favor of the plan that's actually working? That adaptability, that willingness to change without losing direction, is the signature of the genuinely strategic mind. Section 6. Strategy in the Modern World. The battlefield has changed, but the psychology of conflict has not. Robert Greene wrote The 33 Strategies of War in a world before smartphones were ubiquitous, before social media had become the dominant arena of public life, before artificial intelligence had begun reshaping entire industries. And yet, his core insights have not simply survived these changes, they feel, if anything, more urgent. Because the modern world has created new and extraordinarily sophisticated systems for exploiting exactly the weaknesses that Greene spent years documenting. Consider attention. Sun Tzu understood that the commander who controls the flow of information controls the battlefield. Today, entire industries exist to capture and direct your attention, to provoke your anger, to trigger your fear, to activate your tribalism. Because attention is now the primary economic resource of the digital age. Every time you react to a provocative headline, every time you engage with content designed to outrage rather than inform, every time you find yourself in an online argument that leaves you more agitated and less clear, You have ceded your strategic position to an opponent who understood the terrain better than you did. The most important strategic skill in the modern world may simply be the ability to choose where to direct your attention, and to maintain that choice against an environment specifically engineered to subvert it. Office politics, which most people experience as an uncomfortable and distasteful reality of working life, is simply strategic conflict with the violence removed. The same principles apply. Understanding the actual power structure rather than the official one, building alliances before you need them, choosing which conflicts to engage in and which to walk away from, never letting someone else define the terms on which you will be judged. The entrepreneur operating in a competitive market faces strategic problems that Napoleon would have recognized immediately. How do you compete with a far larger, better resourced opponent? The answer Greene would give is the same one Hannibal gave at Cannae. You don't fight them on terrain that advantages them. You find or create terrain where your specific strengths can operate freely. You make your opponent's size a liability rather than an asset. Personal branding, a concept that would have puzzled previous generations but defines modern professional life, is fundamentally a strategic exercise. The way you present yourself, the associations you cultivate, the narrative you allow others to build around your work. These are strategic choices with strategic consequences. The person who manages them thoughtfully operates at a significant advantage over the person who simply reacts to how others define them. And then there is the most intimate arena of modern conflict: our relationships. Greene does not write much explicitly about relationships, but his principles apply here too. The pattern of choosing battles wisely, of distinguishing between what is urgent and what is important, of controlling your emotional response when provoked, of thinking about the long-term health of a relationship rather than the short-term satisfaction of being right, is as relevant in a marriage or a friendship as it is on any battlefield. The person who brings strategic thinking to their relationships is not being manipulative. They are being responsible, because every significant relationship involves conflict, compromise, and the management of competing needs. The question is whether you navigate those forces with awareness or simply collide with them blindly. The mindful reflection. We began with a battlefield. 86,000 Roman soldiers, 50,000 Carthaginians. The mathematics of catastrophe. But the real lesson of Cannae was never about numbers. It was about something Hannibal possessed that the Roman commanders lacked in that terrible afternoon: the capacity to see the situation as it actually was, not as pride or fear or the weight of expectation required it to be. He saw clearly, and clarity, in that moment, was everything. We are all on a battlefield, every day. The terrain changes: office, family, the scrolling expanse of the digital world, the private landscape of our own minds. The opponents change: a difficult colleague, a competitive market, an old belief about ourselves that has stopped being true, a fear that we have never properly examined. But the fundamental challenge never changes. Can you see clearly enough to act wisely? Can you remain calm enough to think when everything around you is pushing you to react? Can you hold the long view when the present moment is pressing with all its urgency? The greatest enemies Greene documented in his study of 3,000 years of human conflict were not rival generals or enemy states. They were impatience, which leads us to act before we understand; ego, which makes us fight battles we should walk away from and retreat from battles we should stand in; fear, which narrows our vision to the threat directly in front of us and blinds us to the wider opportunity. Pride, which makes us prefer a glorious defeat to an unglamorous survival. These are the forces that have defeated more people than any army in history. And they live not in the world, but in us, which means the most important territory any of us will ever need to conquer is the one we carry everywhere we go. Miyamoto Musashi, at the end of a life spent in the pursuit of strategic mastery, wrote something that surprised everyone who expected a book of techniques and tactics. He wrote, "Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Do nothing that is of no use. Think lightly of yourself, not because you don't matter, but because when the self is too heavy, it distorts everything around it. When the ego is the loudest voice in the room stops being real. You stop seeing people and situations as they are and start seeing them as characters in the story you need to tell about yourself. And then the real losses begin." Strategy, at its deepest, the kind that Robert Greene spent years excavating from the ruins of campaigns and courts and the private correspondence of people who had been tested by extraordinary pressure, is not about defeating others. It is about refusing to be defeated by yourself. It is the patient, daily, unglamorous work of becoming the kind of person whose character is an asset rather than a liability in every situation they face. The person who can be trusted to think clearly when thinking is hardest. Who can remain steady when steadiness is rarest. Who can choose, even under pressure, the response that serves their deepest goals rather than their most immediate feelings. That is the art of strategy, not genius, not power, not the ruthless execution of plans. Wisdom, clarity, mastery of self. These are the only victories that compound over time, the only ones that actually last.
So I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before you scroll away. Which is harder to defeat, your enemies or your own emotions? Think about the last significant conflict you faced, whether in work or a relationship or the private arena of your own decision-making. Where did the real resistance come from? Leave your answer in the comments, because I believe that when we can name the inner battles honestly, we become better at fighting them. And that is, in the end, the only strategic victory that changes everything else. If this video made you think differently about conflict, strategy, or what it means to navigate a complicated world with clarity, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more deep explorations of the ideas that shape how we think, act, and live. Until next time, see clearly, act wisely, master yourself.